Welcome back, deadly audience. Each one of our sessions today is going to open up with a special mini session introducing the hottest literary newcomers to the crime scene. We're calling them our opening acts. And this opening act right here is police officer turned historian, Blessing Adams, with Thou Savage Woman, Female Killers in Early Modern Britain. So over to you, Blessing.
Hello, thank you so much. Just a quick question. This does the slides, right? Yes. Okay, cool. My name is Blessing Adams. I am a former police officer. I'm a historian, and I'm also author of Thou Savage Woman, Female Killers in Early Modern Britain, wherein I explore 8 historical true crime cases with a focus on women as the perpetrators of terrible deeds. So the early modern period, roughly between 1500 to 1750, but we could talk about that afterwards if you don't agree, was a fascinating time that encompassed the rise and the fall of the houses of the Tudors and the Stuarts, the English Civil War, the Protectorate, the Restoration and the Glorious Revolution. England split from Rome, and the country was torn asunder by the Protestant Reformation and Counter-Reformations. And through these centuries, countless wars were waged, and plagues ebbed and flowed. Women and men were shaped, sometimes irrevocably so, by the significant events of their time. And while these people may have lived through national and global crises, like us all, they were usually far more concerned by the triumphs and the tragedies that played out on these smaller and far more local stages of their individual lives. So in my book, it is these stories of everyday women, their lives, their crimes, and their deaths that fascinates me. And I'm not alone in that fascination. The early moderns, like us, were intrigued by narratives of gruesome murders, criminal investigations, courtroom dramas, and executions. And one could read about these terrible crimes and criminals in the true crime media of the day. That was explicit, gory printed pamphlets, and for the less literate, broadside ballads, in which the latest murder news was sung in verse to surprisingly jolly tunes. So it was as I was researching my first book, Great and Horrible News, and I was working my way through the surviving accounts of true crime and murder news, that I was struck by how many of these reports were about women. Disproportionately so, considering how then, as now, women rarely committed violent crimes and they rarely killed. Yet if one was to base their understanding of homicide in the 16th and 17th centuries based solely on these reports, then one could easily get the impression that there was an epidemic of female killers in this period. Of course, that simply wasn't true. And yet I wondered why the early moderns seemed so obsessed with these tales of female killers, and why there seemed to be so much alarm, concern, and outrage concerning crimes that, in truth, almost never happened. They were especially intrigued by tales of betraying wives, murdering their husbands, usually by poison, and within the supposed sanctuary of the family home. This was a species of murder so heinous that by law it was deemed to be petty treason, and women found guilty of murdering their husbands were subjected to a traitor's death, being burned alive at stake. Another popular news story was murder by witchcraft, frightening supernatural accounts of hideous women with devilish familiars using magic to maim and murder their friends and their neighbours. The prevalent attitude towards these women was that of fear and disgust. Cases such as these were written about in excess, moralised over, and picked apart to an exhausting degree. And as I explore cases of suspected and actual female killers, I seek to unravel the mystery of this obsession. What was it about these women besides their alleged crimes that made them so famous and so notorious? What were people so afraid of? Was it simply the spectre of the female killer? Or was theirs a horror that had endured from a much earlier time and which perhaps persists today? A horror of domestic rebellion, of women stepping out of place and violently, sometimes cruelly, subverting the belief that by the laws of nature, God and man, women must be subservient, gentle, and meek. I'm going to do a brief reading now from the introduction of Thou Savage Woman. In the autumn of 1680, Letitia Wigington of Ratcliffe, London, was a desperate woman. She had been abandoned by her husband and left to raise their 3 children on the paltry wages she earned as a seamstress. In order to ease her poverty, she took on young female apprentices whose parents paid to have their children instructed in the mysteries of her profession. In September of that year, Letitia was approached by a seaman named Holton, who offered to pay her £5 to take on his 13-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, with the promise of a further £5 to follow once he had returned from his voyage. Perhaps he had not heard the rumours that Letitia had a reputation for being cruel with her charges, or perhaps he simply did not care. As the season gave way to winter, Letitia continued to struggle against the hardship of her economic situation. She eventually decided to take on a boarder, a man named John Sadler, who was a former seaman and then runner of goods. John may have eased the burden of poverty. However, his presence brought disharmony to Letitia's household. A few days after his arrival, he accused Elizabeth of stealing some of his linens, thus causing a rift between the young apprentice and her overly harsh mistress. It was then Christmas Eve, a week after John's arrival, and Elizabeth was in trouble. The exact details of her offence are unclear. She had either spoiled some work or taken some money amounting to a few shillings. Whatever her small fault, it preceded a night of terrible retribution that was later described in court and news reports as an act of inhuman barbarity. The following account of this incident was later given by John and another apprentice named Rebecca. They said that Letitia had ordered John to fashion a whip called a cat with 9 tails, which he did with such exacting care it took him about an hour to complete his task. Elizabeth was then stripped naked and tied with her wrists above her head in the manner of a seaman about to receive a naval flogging. Letitia had Elizabeth held fast and rammed an apron down her throat so that the neighbours could not be alerted by the child's lamentable cries. John then proceeded to whip Elizabeth for 4 hours or more until her back was raw and the blood flowed from her in abundance, wetting the floor beneath her like rain. Not satisfied with the agonies inflicted by flogging alone, Letitia sent for salt and salted Elizabeth's wounds to render their tortures more grievous. The flogging and the salting continued until Elizabeth at last founded away as dead. She was cut down and left to suffer for 3 days before she finally died of her wounds. In the aftermath of this brutal slaying, Letitia was immediately arrested and locked in Newgate prison. Before her trial, she protested her innocence and placed the whole blame on John. However, in court, she merely pleaded little in her defence, only saying that she did not think to kill Elizabeth. She was found guilty and eventually executed at Tyburn on the 9th of September, 1681. Although 2 persons had murdered Elizabeth Holton, the majority of public blame was focused on Letitia. It was Letitia's name that was blazoned across the front pages of the true crime reports, wherein she was cast as the seductive voice in John's ear, the temptress, the woman who had been a great instrument to prompt him on to wickedness. Letitia was viewed as the principal actor in this terrible murder, while John's part was diminished to that of a mindless accessory. Never mind that John had fashioned the whip and delivered the killing blows. Letitia's role in the torture and murder of her young apprentice was considered to be even more outrageous, frightening, and disturbing because she was a woman. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Blessing. And Blessing will be joining the signings after the next session, so you'll all be able to enjoy her book. But it gives me huge pleasure and excitement now to introduce the mighty Hallie Rubenhold with her story of a murder in conversation with Nicola Williams, our Crown Court judge and crime writer extraordinaire. All of these books will be available afterwards. Please give them a big welcome to the stage.
Can everyone? Oh, yes. Okay. Thank you. All right, do you want to try it?
Oh, I think, I'm hooked up to a mic. Okay. Or does, I'm wearing a mic somewhere. Is this working? Yes. Okay, it's working, so I don't need this one. No, I need this one. I'm double mic'd. Okay, so one mic is working. Great.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming. I know that you've come for Hallie and not me. The first thing I had to work out is your name Hallie or Haley?
No, it's Hallie.
It's Hallie, good. So, and the other thing is, there are very few things, having been a barrister for a very long time, having done some pretty gruesome murder trials as a barrister, and now I sit as a Crown Court recorder and I write crime fiction, there's not a lot that sort of intimidates me. But Little Women do, so you're sort of like, because I don't know, because...
What's the story with that?
Oh, no, it's well, I have a cousin who, even though we're almost exactly the same age, but she's probably about your height. And every diminutive woman I've always known to be tiny but mighty.
Oh, good.
So, but anyway, can I say how much I enjoyed this book? I thought it was amazing. And in typical barrister style, I have notes, but I'm not going to be slavishly looking down at them, because that's the one thing you learn from when you do jury speeches. You don't do that. But it's a good sort of opening guide for me. Can I tell you that the way that I first came across your work was actually not through a book, True Confessions. It was through Harlots.
Oh,
Yes.
right, okay.
And I know that you reached a whole new audience with that, because you're not only a social historian, but you also write historical fiction as well.
Yeah.
But certainly with Harlots, and I know it was inspired by, they say, which is a lovely loose term
Yes.
to use, by your Covent Garden Ladies book. But a little fun fact about that, myself, my brother and my sister-in-law, we were so engrossed with it, we had a little Harlots WhatsApp group.
Oh.
So we would say, if you missed anything, what's leading up, what discussion before, bit of a discussion during, and then discussion afterwards. And my brother's not really one for watching stuff like that, but we really got him into that. So I'm really, really
Fantastic.
extra pleased to be here because of that. Okay, another controversial comment. I have to say, I don't normally read true crime because I'm involved professionally in true crime, and some of the cases that I have dealt with, and it reminds me of the chapter entitled Pieces, when you talk about what literally were described as shredded remains of Belle Elmore. It was a little bit too close to home if I read that kind of thing all the time. But I can honestly say I absolutely love this book. As you can see, it has loads of post notes in it, which showed that I really loved it. It really grabbed me in it, and it pulled me along, and it was like the best narrative nonfiction. Did you always plan to write it like that?
Yes, because I do think that sometimes fact is actually more compelling than fiction. I do love them both, but I think there is always an inherent narrative in any story, whether that is a biographical story, whether that is a narrative of a crime. And the wonderful thing about crime stories, as I have discovered, is in many cases they work in a non-linear way.
Yes.
And that has a lot to do with the witnesses, the people involved, because everybody involved will have seen and experienced it in a completely different way.
Yes, absolutely. And depending on the point of view that you take, not around Belle's murder, but and also I don't want to give away too much because it's strange. People think they know about Dr. Crippen and the murders that he did, but when you read this, it gives you a completely different perspective on it. But there's a scene at the Criterion which you tell from two different angles,
Yes.
and I thought that was really masterfully done, as was lots of other things in this book. The very first line that you start the prologue with, well, half of the first line, and it's also certainly on the back of the proof that I had, is that no murderer should ever be the keeper of their victim's story. Why is that so important to you?
Oh, it's enormously important. I think it's important for a number of reasons. First of all, I think the way in which we have internalized crime stories in our culture is it's largely told through the eyes often of the criminal themselves as a sort of thriller. You know, is this person going to get away with this? Or it's often told through the eyes of the detective pursuing the criminal and trying to figure out how the criminal mind works and looking at them. And the victims are all kind of scattered around the sides. And not only the victims, but the families and the communities and all the people who these things really, really affect are not front and center of these stories. And then the other thing that I think is quite important is often the way the news media reports crime. And the very unfortunate thing about well, there are many unfortunate things about a murder, but the way in which murders are positioned, talked about, and examined in court, you have the suspect, the accused, who is being cross-examined, and they present their side of the story. Did they or didn't they kill this person? What were their motives? What was going on? And so they are telling this story. They are able to almost, in some cases, in the case of Crippen, certainly justify what they did. And because that's a sort of ready-made narrative, the news media will jump on that. Well, man kills husband because of X, rather than, wife murdered by brutal man. And so it's the way in which, in some cases, the murderer is given the last word on the story because it's a ready-made narrative prepared for court, and the person who isn't there to give their side of the story is the victim.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, and I don't know if you'd agree with me on this, there's certainly, sadly, modern parallels. When I read that line, the first thing that actually occurred to me, the first case that occurred to me, one of many, is Wayne Couzens and Sarah Everard, because people know her name, but they know his name more.
Yes, that's right.
And now, as time has gone by, they're probably more likely to remember his name than hers.
Yeah.
And that was a case of, if you like, a famous case in the sense that it got a lot of press coverage. There are other cases, because murder is both horrific and sadly quite mundane, in the sense that it happens daily. You might not hear cases daily, but it does happen daily, and it gives me no pleasure to say that. And in a lot of those cases, particularly if they're in a domestic context, you won't hear anything about the victim at all. You might just hear, man kills wife, if you like.
Yeah.
You probably wouldn't even know the name of the person. So that's what I really liked about this and how you've dealt with it. And also another line that I really liked, and I think it really sums up the real impact of a murder, is where you say towards the end of the book, you say that murder is never a single act of destruction, but experienced as a series of interconnected injuries, a spray of shrapnel scattered throughout the lives of anyone in close proximities because of the impact of it.
Yes.
Yeah. So I don't know if you want to elaborate on that.
Well, no, I think this is, and again, this is something that's overlooked. I will confess that I do have an insight to this because my husband is a criminal barrister.
I know. I did my my research. I don't know his name.
Well, he became a King's Counsel this week.
I know that too.
You know that too.
Nicola Williams, never knowingly underprepared.
No, exactly. So you know, a lot of this comes out of conversations and the conversations we have at home about what he faces. And I mean, the stories from the families. And again, these things aren't covered. I mean, I think increasingly we see more of it in the media, but it isn't until fairly recently that we have really looked at the lasting impact of removing a human life and how it disrupts so many. It's like a domino effect, you know, all the people it touches, friends, family, community, workplace, all of this. And this is so under-discussed. And it is so essential to understand in the course of looking at this crime and what it does.
Yes, particularly because to those who loved and knew the victims, it might pass out of the headlines and people might even forget about the case, particularly if it's not a well-known case. But they're living with that all the time, and they'll never, the absence of that person at the table or not being able to pick up the phone and want to, you know, I saw something funny today, I want to share that.
Yeah.
You can't do that. So they live with that long after those of us who might just be reading about it in the newspapers. Not that we wouldn't have sympathy or maybe even put ourselves in a position what it would be like to lose someone like that. But unless you've actually done it, you don't know what it's like.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So you've said that it was important to you that the murderer shouldn't be the keeper of the victim's story, which really means what you have done is that you have centred more the women in the story, in particular Belle. I mean, she wasn't the only one that Crippen killed, but particularly her. Did you get any criticism from people for doing that?
For centering the women?
Yes.
I think the book hasn't been out long enough for people to
Sorry,
to
I've lived in it for a while.
But, you know, I think, you know, there is a sort of feeling that somehow, well, you know, I think for the most part, I think people are very happy to see victims put front and center in stories because it feels morally just. It feels right, and it is right. But then there are some people, you know, already I'm getting these sort of faint rumblings, this pushback from people in the past couple of days. And bear in mind, the book's only been out a couple of days, from people who are saying, well, you know, I mean, Crippen didn't really do this because there was this documentary in 2007 that did a DNA test, and the whole thing's rather spurious and dubious, did a DNA test on some of Belle Elmore's remains, which were kept on a slide, and this was from the trial in 1910. A group of people did a DNA test from this slide and determined that, oh, well, you know, the remains found in the basement of Hilldrop Crescent were a man's, and well, that's bizarre. And then completely twisting the story. So, you know, you get the sort of apogee of all of this kind of, and there has been a lot of Belle Elmore hatred throughout the 20th century. You know,
yes, I want to ask you about that.
Yeah, and the apogee of this is the murderer becomes the victim and the victim becomes the murderer, because it was said, oh well, Belle Elmore didn't step forward, she was obviously alive to prevent Crippen's execution, so therefore she not only wasn't murdered, she actually was responsible for his death. And so there is an appendix at the back of my book, which is an answer to the white paper that was produced by the people who did this DNA test by Professor Turi King, who is responsible for the identification of Richard III's remains. And she basically looked at this test and said, this isn't compelling, and the test should be redone, and this is by no means conclusive. So I think, you know, I guess the jury's still out on that. But
not for me.
Not for you. I think there's a lot. I mean, if you look at the case, which you have, there is a lot of evidence that suggests that he did do it. I can't even believe it. Anybody would ask that question.
Yes, well, Sadly, I know it has. If people have a particular narrative, they will somehow twist all sorts of things in order to fit that narrative. So if the narrative is that not only did he not kill Belle, but somehow she indirectly killed him because she didn't step forward,
Yes.
then someone will find a fact to try and twist it that way.
Yeah.
But overwhelmingly, you could say that it absolutely wasn't the case, because, of course, there was also Charlotte
Yes,
as well.
yes.
And what I really loved about your book, one of the many things, is that it didn't start where you would normally expect it to start. It didn't start with Crippen. It actually started with Charlotte. In terms of a major figure. You know, it talked about other people before, but it started with Charlotte. Why did you think about doing that?
Because it's important to frame the victim, and because the idea of constantly making these stories murderous stories, and, you know, I have said, you know, the whole title of the book is Story of a Murder, Not a Murderer. And so to tell it through the eyes of his first wife, Charlotte, who, I mean, it's obviously there was never a trial, so we don't know if he did kill her, but there's quite a lot of circumstantial evidence that points to him having murdered her.
Yes, particularly the way in which he, you know, he didn't even bother to mark her grave.
Yes.
It's just, yeah, which is not the kind of thing that a bereft widower would do.
No, and 72 hours after she died, she was buried, and then the comment by his father many years later, when the murder of Belle Elmore makes the headlines, and before they've even found that she had hyoscine hydrobromide in her remains, this poison, her father, who is an elderly man living in Los Angeles, his father, who's an elderly man living in Los Angeles, comes forward and says, "Oh, my husband is much too clever. You know, if he had killed his wife, he would have used an undetectable poison and made it look like she had just died of natural causes." And yes.
It's a bit like O.J. Simpson, If I Did It.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can I ask you some practical things? Now, why particularly Crippen? Why this subject?
Well, I mean, obviously, you know, the book I wrote before this was about the five victims of Jack the Ripper.
Yes.
And in the course of that research, there is one unifying theme, one unifying person between the Ripper case and the Crippen case, and that is Chief Inspector Walter Dew of Scotland Yard, who was on the Ripper case as well as a young police officer, and then writes a memoir called I Caught Crippen. And he did catch Crippen, but there were other people involved in this.
Other people helped.
Other people helped. But this is, so I read that in the course of doing the research for the five. And then, you know, and went on and read this other story about how he caught Crippen. I thought, well, that's a very compelling story. But then the more I looked at this, I thought, this really is a story which is largely about women and women's lives, which has been appropriated by men and told by men over and over, and men making the world a safer place, making the world a better place. You know, Inspector Dew writes his memoirs, Captain Henry Kendall, who spotted them on the Montrose, writes his memoirs, all the barristers write their memoirs, you know, and so this is about men making the world a better place, and all the women's experiences, and there were so many women in this case, were just sidelined, and they were fascinating.
Yes, I did find, I've got loads of questions about that to ask you. How long did it take you to research it? Or is it like, how long is a piece of string? Because the detail is absolutely fantastic. And yet it doesn't read like a dry narrative.
Yeah.
It's loads of detail in there.
Yeah.
So how long did, like from nose to tail, how long did it take?
Well, it's a slightly deceptive narrative here, because I had COVID land like right at the beginning of my research process. So I had planned my research trip to the United States April 2020.
Oh, yes.
So needless to say, that didn't happen. And so I had to read around it.
Because you could have been stuck there.
Well, I could
have
have
to
been,
come back.
well, yeah, I mean, but all the archives and libraries closed, including this place, which closed and then opened, and then the Russians hacked the system, and then that collapsed. And, you know, it was just a series of problems. so, I mean, I was able to go into the National Archives for, you know, short spurts, and then I have to read something else. And so when everything did open up, I had to almost redo my research again because nothing made sense. And most of the trial transcripts and all of the police documentation and the statements and everything are kept in boxes at the National Archive. And so I spent a lot of time poring over that over the years and going back and rereading. And one of the things I've learned, and I'm sure you're very familiar with this because my husband said, yes, I experienced that, is you read a witness statement once and you'll pick up on one thing, and then you'll go back a couple weeks later, a month later, and you'll read it again, and you'll see something else. Oh my God, I never noticed that. And then suddenly a piece clicks into place that you hadn't even thought about. And so I had several of those epiphanies as I was working with this material.
Yes. And did you manage to visit, I'm sure you did actually eventually visit the United States, and there were a lot of countries that Crippen had, well,
spent time
nothing
in.
else if not a shifter, which I'll come on to in a minute, but between Crippen and then Crippen and Ethel, there were a lot of countries involved.
Yes.
Did you visit all of them?
I tried to. Well, but obviously, we did a little bit of a road trip. So we went to Salt Lake City. We drove from San Diego to Salt Lake City, which is where the Crippens lived, and we went to New York, and we went to Brooklyn, and that. There's something about when you're writing, visiting place that is so important.
Yes.
That's so important because sometimes it's like, you know, it's like making a site visit and you realize, oh, that house is much smaller than I imagined it was. Or, oh, look what's on the corner of that street. I had no idea. Or, you know, you get a sense of space and you get a sense of how people lived in a space. And so I felt, you know, especially going to Brooklyn and Salt Lake City, that was really, really important to this. I also went to Ireland as well, where Charlotte's family were from. Yes. And again, that was hugely, I mean, I think there's something, you know, even when you're writing nonfiction, your imagination has to engage.
Yes.
And it's these two things working together. And it's a very fine line you have to walk between, you know, I don't want to embellish, I want to be very correct, but also I want to get the human experience in. And it's so important to visit places, and that helps to contribute to that
yes,
sense.
And certainly the human experience is writ large throughout this book, but particularly about the women. And I want to ask you about the Ladies' Guild, but before I get on to that, there was one word which kept coming back to me as I read this book, and that was the word shifting. Because I thought about Crippen, not just him, but him particularly. He shifted in terms of changing career and then changing medical specialty within his career. He moved from place to place. He had lots of fraudulent businesses.
Yes.
His identity overall was a very sort of fluid and not in a good way.
Slippery.
Absolutely, absolutely. Some people described him as a kind person. Most people would say that he was calculating. And he seemed to be very concerned about appearances and how he was thought of. And, for example, he looked down on Belle because of her music hall connections, but he definitely liked the money that came from that and going to certain restaurants that came from that.
Yeah.
Now, it's a word that, well, two questions. First of all, do you agree about what I've said about shifting?
Totally.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And the other thing, and people bandy this word about a lot, narcissist, but it seemed to me that he was really a malignant, apart from being a murderer, which he really was, and probably maybe a psychopath, though I'm not a psychiatrist, but he was a malignant narcissist in the sense that he seemed to have absolutely no empathy for anybody.
Absolutely.
And even, you know, starting from his son, but loads and loads of people, and even with Ethel, when he was prepared to just ditch her.
I know. I know. Yeah. I know. Absolutely agree with that assessment. And this is why it's always annoyed me that people have tried. And it's interesting. I mean, in the early 20th century, I think people were much more trusting. I think we are deeply cynical now, much more so than people were in the past. And if somebody presents as a gentleman, if they hold themselves as a gentleman, if they dress as a gentleman, if they use all of the manners of a gentleman, or a gentlewoman, they can pull the wool over people's eyes. And Crippen really leaned into that. I mean, that was his superpower.
Yes, it was. He really understood that aspect of human nature, sadly.
Yes. Yeah.
I really did.
But it is very interesting to look, and you mentioned this, the people around him. It's so interesting to see who he surrounds himself with. He's surrounded by crooks and fraudsters and violent criminals also, and people who have gone to prison, people who are always on the run changing their names. Real fraudsters, he gets involved in what today we would describe as a Ponzi scheme. Also, he's involved in stock fraud. He's got a finger in all of these pies, and all these people he works with, all of his associates, are convicted criminals in many cases.
And I think some of the women as well, there was that element of shifting as well, not in the malignant way that he did, but for example with, Cora, before Belle, Cora, and then she had 5 different name changes. And I like the fact that the last one was the one that she chose herself.
Yes.
Anyway. So I thought that was really great. So that's why you've used all her different names,
yes.
as you should, but Belle is the one that
she
chose
sticks,
and she chose that one herself. But in part, the name changes would have been because of the time. It would have been to either disguise a perceived ethnic identity,
yes.
or to raise yourself up a class status.
Yes.
And the same thing with Ethel, the Neves changed the name to Le Neve.
Yes.
And even Charlotte, poor benighted Charlotte, we come from a Protestant landowning family,
yes.
and they didn't.
Yes.
So
yes.
do you think that element of shifting was there too?
Yeah, oh, totally. And fascinating that, people could do this in the 19th and early 20th century because, now it's much more difficult to assume other identities. But people were constantly reinventing themselves. And I think that's part of what this era was about, this turn of the century. And there was this, especially in the United States as well, the Crippens were Americans, and this idea that you could make a mess of your life in this town and then just move into another town, change your names, change your occupation, change everything, find another spouse, and you could do this for the rest of your life in a sort of succession of shifts and changes. I think Crippen was doing this in the United States. I think he was running...
Yes, he absolutely did.
Yes, and he was running from debt in many cases. But, God knows what else he may have been running from as well. And I do wonder about that.
Probably the murder of his first wife.
Possibly,
yes.
yeah.
Going back to his attitude towards women, 2 unnecessary operations. Well, certainly you believe they're unnecessary, and I do too. The surgical menopause on
yes.
Belle when she was only 21 years
yeah.
old. And that was mainly because he had a son who he didn't really want and foisted off to somebody else and definitely didn't want to have any more children. As someone who's a medical man, I'm sure there would have been ways of contraception he could have used, but didn't want to do that. So he gave her a complete complete hysterectomy, but everything removed. I know there's a particular word for it, and I'm blanking on it now. And then also with Ethel, when you removed 20 of her teeth.
Yes. Yeah.
What do you think that says about him and women?
He liked tinkering with women's bodies. I think this was...
That's major tinkering. That's
taking
it apart.
Well, this was his identity. So I think, Crippen trained as a homeopath, and at the time in the 19th century, homeopathy was seen as a bona fide, field of medicine. And you went through medical training, and you did anatomy courses, and you trained, and you did all the various things you did to become a doctor. But he also had a specialism, just to make him extra creepy, and that was obstetrics and gynecology. and so he was, he even came here for a while to study, and some of the most disturbing stuff that I found were the papers that he wrote. And he was a prolific medical writer for medical journals. He really took himself seriously, and then at some point he went over to the dark side and ended up in patent medicine and medical fraud. But while he was taking himself seriously, he came to London to Bedlam, or Bethlehem Hospital, as it was known, and was studying women, the gynecology, looking at the links between gynecological problems and women's mental health. And that was enormously disturbing. There are aspects of this book that, as I was writing it, I was thinking, this is so gothic. I cannot believe how gothic this is. And so he was fascinated with women's bodies. He was fascinated with controlling women. the interesting thing was he didn't seem to go for weak women. He went for women who actually were remarkably strong.
He just wanted to break them.
He wanted to
It's more of a challenge.
control them. Yeah.
Yeah, which is very sort of in Andrew Tate land. Kind of
Yes,
thing.
it
yes,
is.
you know, you don't go for already compliant, quote unquote, submissive women.
Yeah.
You go for, well, clearly I've been spending too much time on the internet. but you go for women that they describe as feminists in a negative way, and modern women and independent women, and just want to break those women rather than, yeah, it's very sick.
Yeah.
Because it's all about control then.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. But on a more positive thing for women, I loved Belle as a character, and I loved the ladies of the guild.
Oh, aren't they wonderful?
They're absolutely amazing, and I don't think that, all right, lots of people led to Crippen eventually being captured, but they were the ones that really kick-started it.
Yeah.
Absolutely, I thought they were great.
Yeah, I mean, so this is one of the interesting things is, you know, as I've said, this story has traditionally been told as, you know, a male story, how men made the world a safer place by capturing this criminal. But the bit of the story that's always been left out is the role played by the Music Hall Ladies Guild. And the Music Hall Ladies Guild were, well, so Belle Elmore became, she wanted to be an opera singer. Crippen was then moved to London for his work, for Munyon's Remedies, which was a patent medicine scam. And Belle came with him, and she couldn't, you know, she didn't think it was practical to go and try to become a successful opera singer in London, and so she thought, oh, I'm going to go on the stage and become a musical performer. And she was able to do that. You know, it was, like many people, her music hall career did not take off, but she found another way of fulfilling herself.
Yes, she did.
And that was through the Music Hall Ladies Guild. And the Music Hall Ladies Guild was a charitable organization run by women for women who worked in the music hall. And these were women who'd fallen on hard times. Well, the Music Hall Ladies Guild were successful music hall women. And they helped women who had fallen on hard times. You know, they raised money so these women could pay their rent, so they could have coal for their fire, so they could pay their doctor's bills, so their children could have clothes. And Belle became the treasurer of the Music Hall Ladies Guild, and she was hugely involved in this and their activities, to the extent that one year she was awarded, you know, the sort of Member of the Year award, and she was given this bracelet, which was a gold bangle that said, "To the hustler," because she'd managed to get all this money.
And it's so interesting using that word hustler. I always think of it as a decidedly modern context, but clearly not.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, she was a go-getter, but, you know, she really found her kind of métier in this charity work, and she loved it, and she loved the society of these incredibly fascinating women who were all performers, you know, tightrope walkers and equestrian performers and pantomime artists and singers, and just fascinating women.
Yes, and I think they're a wonderful counterpoint to. It's a real sisterhood for her.
Yes,
and you know, as someone who very much wanted to be a mother. I mean, she'd been pregnant before when she was much younger, but she very much wanted to be a mother, and she couldn't. And this really gave her not only a calling in the sense of being able to use her voice, but a way of feeling useful, and people really appreciating her and loving her when she had a husband who didn't love her. So that really helped as well. But then you have, they're very sisterly, unlike her friend, so-called Adeline Harrison.
Frenemy.
Who is a B word with dash
yes,
afterwards.
yes.
She's awful. I mean, she's really, it's not a word I use lightly. She really is horrible.
She was a horrible woman.
Yes. And then also Ethel, who, you know, she really wanted her, basically what she wanted was Belle's life, Belle's entire life.
Yes.
Her friends, her musical roles, even though she didn't sing, everything. She just basically wanted her life.
Yeah.
And so they were very malign examples of the sisterhood, but the Music Hall Ladies Guild, they were really fascinating.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I didn't know anything about them until I read this book. But do you think, if it wasn't for the persistence of those ladies, do you think that this murder would have been solved?
No, it would have passed under the radar, and that's why. And it's very interesting because, you know, you mentioned Ethel. Ethel was certainly not part of the sisterhood. Ethel, to the day she died, never expressed a word of remorse for Belle, her friends, her family, because Ethel had internalized this as those Music Hall Ladies Guild women ruined her life. Because they could have got away with this. You know, she could have been Crippen's wife, and instead, Crippen was executed. And you know, and it was
instead of blaming him for the murder.
Yes, yeah, and it was, and I think, you know, we were talking about his psychology, and again, you know, I will give the similar caveat that you have. I'm not a criminologist, and I'm not a psychologist, but I do think she was a psychopath. Mm-hmm. She had absolutely no remorse at all.
Yeah. But it's so interesting because in Inspector Dew, at first he believed that she was very much a villain, then all of a sudden, she was an innocent dupe who's just been dragged along by this man.
Yes.
But that said a lot more about how women were perceived in those days, I think.
Yes.
And he was almost taken in by that. So, yeah. But I agree with you with that. If it wasn't for their involvement, it wouldn't have been solved. But I note that Linian Nash, it was only when her husband, John Nash, got involved.
Yes, exactly.
That all of a sudden people sat up and started to pay attention.
Yes.
When the ladies were talking about it, no one was really paying attention. Yes. Both because to my mind, because they were women and because they were music hall performers and therefore a bit demi-monde.
Yes.
But as soon as a man gets involved, suddenly people start sitting up and they take notice. But at least it got solved because it looked like it wasn't going to be.
Yeah.
So do you think then that, did you find in doing your research for this book and writing it that there was either misogyny and or class bias against Belle in particular?
Yes.
Also possibly a little bit against the ladies of the guild as well because of what they did. Did you find that?
Oh, totally. And also anti-Americanism.
Yes, absolutely. A lot of othering.
Yes, a lot of othering. And I don't know if you noticed, in the trial what I found so interesting was a lot of things that were said by the defense in the trial, Crippen's defense, was to try to continue to blacken Belle's character so that there was this subtle insinuation that she, you know, well, her family was Polish, and they kept saying, well, her father was a Pole, he was a Pole. You know, trying to pull on this kind of strand of anti-Semitism, even though she was Catholic.
Yes, absolutely.
Exactly, yeah.
It was, do you think that could happen today?
You would have a better sense of whether that happens in the courtroom. Somebody had asked me that, and I really had to pause and think, because I would like to say that doesn't happen, but you would have another take on that altogether.
Well, I will give you my Cliff Notes answer, but I think it'd be great because I'm coming up to my last few questions, so I'll open it up to the floor. Could it happen today? People might try it. There are certain... there would be checks and balances to prevent that happening. It doesn't mean people don't try it, though. And I had someone in a case in front of me actually try that. You know, I put a stop to it, but I was quite surprised because this was someone who was very experienced. Definitely not your husband.
I'm glad to hear that.
Definitely, no, it's not him. But he was someone who was really long in the tooth, so I know that he did that deliberately. And so I had to tell him in front of the jury, no, you've got to stop that.
Yeah.
Don't do it. In fact, I had to pull him out twice. Once in the absence of the jury, second time in front of the jury, because I knew exactly what he was doing with that. You know, I'm not an idiot, so I knew what he was doing with that. And the thing is, he didn't need to do it because actually the case was he was a defense barrister, but the case was actually a weak one anyway. Yeah. But the fact that he went there, and that was only no more than 2 years ago.
Yeah.
So
sadly, I'm not surprised to hear that.
Yeah. Yes. In terms of the gruesomeness of the finding of Belle's remains in the chapter called Pieces, and that never was a chapter more appropriately named, because literally it was, I mean, be prepared for a strong stomach when you read that. And even now I've been involved in murder trials, and I've seen some pretty awful things, but it was hard to read. And I could just imagine how hard it would have been for you to research that. Yeah. Was it difficult?
Yeah, it was. And actually, what I found myself increasingly getting upset about with this case when I was reading about it is just how, and I say that in that chapter, how dehumanized Belle becomes. So from that point, when her body is, well, her remains are discovered.
Shredded remains.
Shredded
That's exactly what they
remains.
was. Well,
Yeah.
absolutely.
That she ceases to be a human being. And the way in which she is discussed, you know, by the coroner, but then, I mean, obviously there's a reason why, you know, there has to be, you know, there's an inquest. People have to figure out, the scientists have to figure out what exactly happened to her body. They have to try to figure out how she was murdered, and I understand that. But then she becomes just pieces. She becomes a hair curler. She becomes a piece of hair. She becomes...
She becomes a piece of flesh, actually.
She becomes a piece of flesh, yeah. She becomes, you know, viscera. And her being as a human being is just eradicated. And that, I found that really hard. But I also find that, you know, I think so many people are armchair detectives. And I think while it's totally appropriate if you are a pathologist to do that, I think we do have to kind of pull back from our instincts as armchair detectives, and perhaps temper that with a reminder that these people were human beings and they had lives and identities. They're not just, you know, a toxicology report.
Yes, indeed. I've got one more question for you. In fact, I've got loads, but I'm going to ask one more before I open up to the audience. Using modern parlance, do you think that Captain Kendall and even Inspector Dew, do you think they were the definition of male allies?
No, I mean, I think these were men who were just, you know, and I hate using this term as well, but because it's a blanket term, they were products of their time. And they were, you know, men are supposed to go out and be heroes. And one of the problems with a lot of true crime and the way it has been traditionally told historically is it becomes stories about heroes and villains. And, you know, the world becomes just kind of polarized. There are bad people, there are good people. And so, you know, so a villain like Crippen exists to elevate these men and their stories. I don't think, they don't care about Belle Elmore. And in fact, you know, Captain Kendall basically writes that, you know, terrible things about Belle Elmore, a woman he never even met, you know. So it was sort of like by the by, she was murdered. And I often wonder when people write like this about murder victims, you know, they're seemingly suggesting that these people almost deserved it. But the important thing was the villain was caught, not that this person was murdered and that there needs to be justice. And somehow there's a disconnect between what justice actually is. You know, and justice is justice for the victim.
Yes.
And it's not necessarily about catching the criminal. It's about that something is done that is restorative for that person whose life was taken.
Yes, yes. Clearly, you know about restorative justice.
Yes.
Yes, okay. All right, that might be a good time to open up for some questions. So, I know we've got some that are, I'm not very techie. I have strengths, but technology is not one of them. So I don't know where they will come up, but we'll start with ones in the audience, if anyone. Yes, the lady with the glasses, and then Io in front of her, please. Oh.
Io's a celebrity. She's everywhere.
I know. Yes, she is. She is. All right, so there's a lady sitting immediately behind Io there, and then you know you're a celebrity when people only use your first name.
Yes, exactly.
Hello, my name's Wendy, if you need to refer to me.
Okay.
Hallie, essentially you are a historian. You are approaching your books with with historical methods. You mentioned the word embellish and treading that thin line between fact and fiction, I guess. And my question is, to what extent do you use creativity to fill the gaps? There are always gaps, obviously, in doing research. There are always gaps that you have to fill. And to what extent do you use creativity to fill those gaps?
I wouldn't necessarily describe it as creativity. I would describe it as informed picture painting. Because I don't allow myself just to imagine something. I look at the set of circumstances around a situation which we may not have an answer for, and I look at, well, what were other people's experiences in this particular time and place, and how might that have been what this person experienced? So I overlay that, and that's how I do it. And also, you know, thinking about human emotion as well. Well, what might have been this person's, you know, if this person was deprived of X or Y or Z, they must have been feeling anger or resignation or sadness. And to suggest that, I don't think it's so much imagination as an understanding of the human condition.
Aya, thank you for your question. Aya?
We've been talking a lot about research, and I just wondered if, when you were doing your research for this book, and especially when it comes to the fact that it's true crime, is there anything that you found that you thought, if I put this in the book, nobody's going to believe me?
Well, you know, as I said, truth is stranger than fiction. I think, you know, there are things that just makes a true crime story even better when you find those things and you just lay it out for people. Because it's not about whether people will believe it or not. If this is a true story, you can footnote it, and they can read it for themselves in the documentation. So, you know, that's what I always do. I mean, the story in itself is so appealing because there are so many things like that you think, that is really incredible. The fact that, you know, Ethel and Crippen ran off together, and Ethel basically dressed as his son. They became father and son, and Crippen shaved off his moustache, and they went on the run. And, you know, there's all this stuff. Ethel, we didn't talk that much about Ethel, but my God, she is a really complex character.
Glad you didn't. I didn't like her.
I know, a lot, and I love...
Totally subjective opinion.
But I love that people have this kind of really kind of difficult relationship with Ethel, because I did too. You know, and this is one of the things that Ethel says. Throughout, she says, oh, I had no idea that he had killed his wife. I had no idea. And it's so obvious that she knew. So obvious. There's so much evidence to suggest that she knew very well and was involved very intimately with this. But today, you know, saying that, it's like, well, nobody's going to believe that. But in a way, it's kind of good, because then I lay out all the other stuff and you can see, and people can make their own decisions. And so as long as you make sure you're showing everything, there's nothing that becomes unbelievable.
Thank you. Anyone else from in the room? Sorry.
We had someone. The same question.
Okay, I couldn't see your hand, but yes, please. Is there somebody at the back who wants to ask a question?
No, it is the same question.
It's the same question.
It's the same question. Is there anyone who wants to ask a different question? Have we all stunned them into silence?
Oh,
Surely
no,
not.
we've got hands. We've got hands.
Elaine, in your research, did you come across a character called Sir Bernard Spilsbury?
Yes, Bernard Spilsbury was one of the pathologists involved.
We've been reading, our little group to the right here, have been reading a book recently based on a true crime called Other Women by Emma Flint. And in her research, it sort of threw up that various people called into question his approach, because he'd never have anybody else around him. Did you discover much about him?
Well, I wasn't. He was rather a peripheral figure in this story, because there's so many other. You'll see it at the front of my book. I have literally a cast of characters, and there are so many people. And he really has Bernard Spilsbury has a sort of walk-on role here. This was at the very, very beginning of Bernard Spilsbury's career, before he attained that fame. So he was called upon. This was one of, I think, his very famous early cases.
Thank you. Someone at the back? Yes.
Hi. This is a follow-on from a question earlier where somebody asked about adolescence and what you think about the lack of the victim story in there.
Do you mean the Netflix program
Yeah.
Adolescence? Okay. Was this in the previous discussion?
Yes, but I
Okay.
don't think we discussed the lack of the victim.
Yes.
Well, that's interesting. I have only seen the first episode so far of Adolescence, and it's really interesting because it's interesting you should say that, because my instinct was, after having seen the first episode, which is so compelling. I mean, my eyes were out on stalks, and I was sitting on the edge of my seat. And actually, I was watching with my husband. He said, "I can't watch any more of this. It's too much like work."
And to be honest, I haven't watched it yet. I am actually going to watch it because it's based on 2 real-life murders. And
Yeah.
one of them happened probably less than 5 miles from where I live. And so it's, I didn't know the family or anything like that. But, it's absolutely something that can happen.
Yeah.
Can happen and has happened.
Yeah.
But it's, from what everyone says, it's absolutely amazing. I think it might be like Mr. Bates in the post office. One of
Yeah.
those things that really
Transformative.
changes,
Yeah.
it really changes things.
Yeah.
So it's interesting your husband said that.
Yeah, it's too much like work. I can't watch this. And I had said to him, I said, oh, I really hope the second episode, they're obviously going to do the victim. And it's interesting you should say that, because now I know they don't. And wow, that's quite something. And actually, that makes me angry, because that's the piece that I felt was so obviously missing, both as somebody who writes about this, but also somebody who works in television, and that they omitted that is really an unforgivable oversight, I think. No, look, I mean, unnecessary
Most people know
spoiling, I think.
Yeah, most people know what it's about.
Yeah.
I have to say, controversial comment coming up here. I agree with you that I wish within what they did that the victim was within that. But I think if they were going to do another series like Adolescence 2, I think the impact of it will be lessened.
Yeah.
So in that case, what it means is that they've missed an opportunity.
Yeah.
Stephen Graham's like a national treasure.
I know he is. I know.
He really is.
I've finished working on 1,000 Blows, which is.
And you know what? I didn't know this, but one of my good friends was a script supervisor on 1,000 Blows.
Oh, really? What, who?
Emma Thomas.
Emma Thomas. I didn't meet her.
Look, she'd have been one of the few black people on the other side of it. No, she's won a BAFTA and everything. So
Wow.
it's very well known. Yeah, she's one of my oldest friends.
Great.
So, and I haven't seen that yet, but apparently everyone says it's really good.
It's great. Yeah.
Yeah. Is there anything before it gets too cozy up here?
Yes, I know.
Are there any questions online? Because I don't know if they would come up there, and I don't know if anyone's taking them. Because yesterday there were. Okay. Any other questions within the hall? Yes. Down the front, please.
Hi, I'm Maha. I was just wondering, when you were starting this process of writing, did you come into this with any kind of perceptions or assumptions that were then kind of blown away in your research, or something that's kind of really surprised you as you're going along?
I think what surprised me was Ethel, because I wasn't quite sure if she was telling the truth or how much of what she was telling was the truth. And then as I got more and more into the research, I realized how guilty she was. And actually, well, I'm afraid if I say this, it's going to be a spoiler. Should I say it? Should I not say it?
I think you've got some dedicated fans who are buy your
Oh, okay. So what surprised me after reading about really investigating this, looking at this, was just how guilty she was. And the real injustice was that there was no effort really to give her a rigorous trial, and that she was just waved through, and there was no evidence nobody went out of their way to try to actually gather evidence against her. And she was so obviously an accomplice, and she was freed. And that to me shocked me, actually.
Do you think in the context of the time it was that shocking, though? Because, well, I say that, and we just heard that reading from before about a woman being hanged and a man not, so maybe you're right. This is what I thought before I heard that reading. So
yeah.
That what they really wanted to do is almost like row her out of it, because they wanted to see her as this poor innocent dupe who was pulled along by this this
Svengali.
this Svengali, an American Svengali,
Yeah.
no less, you know, so therefore
Yeah.
othered. So, you know, they started off thinking that she was as guilty as he, and then the narrative just
Yes,
changed.
yeah.
Do you think that's what happened? Because I think they didn't want to think that a woman could be guilty of something so heinous.
Yes, and I also think this kind of covers up the mistakes in the policing very early on as well, because I don't think Inspector Dew was a very good police inspector. I think he made some really catastrophic errors in this case, and I think that one of them was that he was so single-minded about Crippen that he just wouldn't even consider Ethel, even though she was obstructive. You know, I mean, in all of the statements that he gave, his police report that he wrote up, and Arthur Mitchell, his sergeant, wrote up, they were talking about how obstructive she was when they went to question her, and all of these other things that happened, how she ran up the stairs to go and warn him.
I was thinking, talk about rookie policing.
I know.
101. You don't let the suspect go upstairs. So they could like tell the main person.
Yes, the police are here.
Yeah.
Yes, I know. And how he just didn't want to believe she was guilty. And so, and the witnesses, her sister, her landlady, all these people who were making these statements about, oh, she was engaged and she wore an engagement ring. You know, the week before Belle was murdered.
And lots of Belle's jewellery.
And wore Belle's jewellery, and just there was tons of evidence and no one ever gathered it.
Yes.
And to me, I think that was awful.
Yeah. The strange smell coming from the cellar.
Yes, a strange smell coming from the cellar. Well, I can't imagine what that... Oh, it was because Belle's such a dirty, filthy woman. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Yes. This person here, and then at the very back. And then this gentleman here, so 1, 2, 3, yes.
Hi, I'm Rachel. If Crippen wasn't caught when he was, do you think that Ethel would have been his next victim? Or perhaps because she was culpable, she might have seen the way the wind was turning and gotten away?
I don't know. It's hard to say. It's really hard to say because Ethel knew that Belle had been murdered. She absolutely knew. And I think that is what sealed that relationship. It was almost like a kind of secret marriage in blood, and like a blood pact. And I think maybe knowing what she did know, she might have been a bit cannier in how she lived the rest of her life. You can only speculate. But I think he had met his match with her. I think they were really suited in a very dark sort of way.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. Gentleman back.
Hi, could you name one reason why people are interested about Dr. Crippen?
Today?
Yeah.
Well, you know what? I have found both is true, that he has been both forgotten by some people and remembered by others. And it just really depends. I think, we have this almost like this kind of canon of true crime in this country, of all these people who, Reg Christie and Dr. What's his name? Dr. Cream and the Brides in the Bath, Haig and Jack the Ripper. And I think this comes from years of, Madame Tussauds and, this sort of glamorizing of these crimes and these criminals in really the worst sort of way. I think it's kind of petered out a bit. I mean, it still survives, but Crippen's crime isn't remembered, I think, as much necessarily as the others. And it's funny, when I was writing this book and people were asking questions, and they were saying things like, oh, Crippen, he's the one, the Brides in the Bath. No, that wasn't him. Oh, is he the one who, in the walls, Rillington Place? No, that was Christie. And so it's now becoming all a sort of mishmash in people's heads, which I think is kind of good, actually, because why should we remember these people and their horrific crimes?
Yes, because as we said at the very beginning, we remember the names Crippen and Christie, but we don't remember necessarily the names of the victims. So
yeah,
yes,
yeah.
Yes. Thank you for that. And yes, this gentleman down here.
Thank you. I think you two are a really good double act.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have to tell you, I was really nervous about
You nervous?
I seriously was. We know how to style it out as barristers. So, but thank you very much for that.
You're very welcome. I wanted to ask Haley, how much does your TV and film work inform your book work and vice versa?
Well, I think in terms of storytelling, I think, and I will admit this, and other authors I've spoken to will admit this, one of the things I feel that has influenced my understanding of how to tell a story on a page are really good box sets. Because, the best box sets are, they're epic, they're incredible, but they tell you how to basically get in and out of an episode or in and out of a chapter, and how to hold the attention. And I think it's taught me a lot about narrative, about to introduce things that happened at a time that, to do non-linear tellings. So I think the non-linear telling of a story is so important, and to do unexpected things, introduce death much earlier on than it may have been if you told it from another perspective. So I think I'm learning from it. I think there are other authors that are learning from very good box sets as well.
Yes, well, I certainly, way back when I first started.
Microphone.
Oh, I'm so sorry. That's why I feel lulled into just like a coffee table discussion.
Yes, you're sitting in a cafe.
Yes. I certainly think in my own writing, I'm influenced not just what I do for a living, actually. I try to step back a little bit from that because I write legal thrillers. It's the visuals of legal thrillers, like John Grisham when he was really good back in the day, but also a really good box set. One of the best ones, not the only one of the best ones I remember seeing is House of Cards. I just thought it was, and I have to say the American House of Cards, I know people are a little sniffy about that, but I thought it was really good, about character, about Frank Underwood and the character that he was, and I thought it was absolutely great. But you're absolutely right, because you've got maybe 6 to 8 episodes to tell it in, and you've got a long period of time, but not a very long period of time.
Yeah.
So you can get some exposition of character, but it has to come to an end. So I totally agree with you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Totally agree with you.
You're welcome.
I have a question for you. Oh,
Sure.
hold on. Sorry, this lady here, and then I have a question.
Oh, thank you so much for your riveting sort of discussion that you've been having. Last night, it's not that I watch all these things all the time, but last night I was watching a thing about Hindley and Brady, and the theme that I was hearing from the other lady as well about women killers, and you, Haley, were talking about Ethel. Is there a thing about women being killers that is such a big thing? Because, in the programme last night, they were kind of saying how the police just didn't want to believe that Hindley was guilty. And they tried to pin it totally on Brady and actually on another male member of the family kind of thing. So is that a kind of, that we're reversed to this idea of women killers?
Yeah, I think society and culturally, I think that is this idea that, women are passive, women are loving and maternal and gentle, and, we've all been inculcated in that, to believe that. And I think that's why, there is a resistance to believing that a woman could kill, that a woman could be violent, that a woman could do these terrible things. And I think we still struggle with that. Would you agree?
Yes, I do. You tend to see, even if I think about the arc of my own career, very, very few, well, comparatively few, overall crime altogether, still fewer women than men. Serious violent crime, less than murder, much smaller numbers of women compared to men. And murder or manslaughter, crikey, I could only think of one that I've had. So it's, and you actually query whether or not that's because maybe there are more, but because of what people think about women, oh, you know, she can't kill, she doesn't look the type who could
Yeah,
kill.
well, she doesn't look the type.
Yeah, it doesn't
You
look
know, I
the
mean,
type,
that
yes.
was Ethel all
Yes,
over.
yes. And maybe as a result, those don't get prosecuted. And I've never even thought about that, but maybe one of the reasons why, I do think that women are less likely to kill than men. And thankfully, the percentage of killers in the general population is very, very small, because otherwise you wouldn't want to step out of your house if that was the case. But then you wonder, maybe it's because a police officer thought, oh, well, you know, I don't know, maybe it wasn't. Particularly if it's someone that's maybe older or frail, such a sweet old lady, and you know, all sorts of things could be going through their head.
Yeah.
So, yes. Any other questions? I've got one for you. In fact, I've got two, but I'm saving my last one as the crescendo, I guess. Second to last one. What was the role of what was then considered modern technology, for example, the wireless, in capturing Crippen? What do you think it played a role? Or
I think this is the Marconi wireless has become the iconic thing in this story because this was this modern innovation, you know, technological innovation, wireless telegraphy on board a ship. And people fixate on this, you know, it's a fact. And I think people like facts, and especially when it comes to true crime, people like facts. So what had happened was Captain Kendall identified the fact that he had these two very strange-looking father and son on his ship and used this Marconi wireless, you know, bearing in mind that until that time, if you wanted to send a message, or, you know, telephones were in existence as well, everything was wired, it was all LAN. And this was wireless telegraphy, and there were receivers on the coastline, and you could, you know, Morse code a message to a receiver, which would then be relayed. And this was the case, and Kendall messaged his shipping company. The shipping company got in touch with Scotland Yard, and Scotland Yard put Walter Dew on a ship called the Laurentic, which then raced the Montrose to Canada.
But it was rare to have wireless telegraphy on a ship. I mean,
yes, it was very
the Montrose
unusual.
was one of very few at the time that had it.
Yeah.
And had they been on another vessel, maybe we wouldn't have known about it.
Well, absolutely. It's fate, isn't it?
Yeah. A lot of, when they say truth is stranger than fiction, that's
truth
what
is
they
stranger
mean.
than fiction.
Yes. I've got another question for you. Towards the end of the book, this is at the time that the Old Bailey trial was about to start, because they had a committal, which was, in old parlance, the old-style committal, where you actually tested some of the evidence. And then they had the trial itself. And it struck me as trials as free entertainment, almost.
Yes.
Because of people, and that happens, it certainly happens for the bigger trials, and it happens a lot in the States, and it definitely happens here as well. I remember when, this is a while ago, but there used to be 3 older gentlemen that would come into Isleworth Crown Court, and they were well known, very polite and everything. They'd say, oh, what good case is on today? And they'd go over the list and they'd talk about it, and then they'd decide to go in and sit in the court. And at some point, one of them would take out their sandwiches. I'm not making any of this up. I saw it, so that's why I know. And the thing that amazed me was that he was allowed to do that. And nobody said anything about that. That wouldn't be happening in my court.
No.
But I think it was because they were just known as, they were kind of harmless, and they were probably would consider themselves maybe Thursday Murder Club type of people.
Yeah.
And they would literally, they knew so much about different lawyers, they probably could have given some legal advice. They were in the courts so often. And they came in because it was free entertainment. If you got an interesting case, it is entertaining.
Yeah.
Did you find that in relation to your research on this and the trial of Crippen? Was that how people saw it?
Yeah, it was absolutely fascinating. It was a show trial. It was, and people, I have put pictures in my book of, and this was, it blew me away, the crowds that gathered, first outside of Bow Street, where they went for their committal. And at the time, people were clamoring to get into this trial, and they couldn't. So they climbed up on the roof of Bow Street Magistrates Court and looked in through the skylights. And then for the Old Bailey trial, they had to issue tickets, and they issued half-day tickets, so you could go in for half of the day. If you had a blue ticket and a red ticket, you could go in for the other half of the day. And there were so many people, and there is a photograph, and actually I had that photograph blue tacked to the top of my computer screen as I was writing this chapter, of this enormous crowd outside the Old Bailey, just milling around, waiting to hear news. You know, what had happened that day, you know, and also bearing in mind that there were, you know, a lot of the witnesses were music hall performers, so there were celebrities involved in this trial. And, you know, you could catch a glimpse of a celebrity going in or out, and so people were just kind of electrified by all of this.
Yes. I think the worry both then and now is when people start to see trials as entertainment, they forget, you know, there are real people involved.
Yes,
here.
that's right.
You know, there are real victims, a real accused, because, you know, it's not every accused has committed the offence, but I mean, it can get skewed, and people think it's just like a drama being played out, like a play being played out in front of you, rather than real people involved. Anyone else? Well, I think I'm going to give you the last 6 minutes to talk about whatever you want.
The last 6 minutes. I think there was a woman in the centre who had her hand up.
Oh, did I miss someone? Yes. Oh, yes. Okay.
Hi, yeah, so I'm not used to using these things. Do you think the fact that he had the title Doctor made a difference to the way he was seen by the women that he met, and also how he was portrayed in the media?
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because his qualifications were not recognised in this country. So he was called Mr. Crippen here, though Ethel referred to him as the Doctor. And you know, his friends kind of called him Dr. Crippen. But when he was referred to in the press here, he was called Mr. Crippen. So I think, you know, he had medical knowledge. I think the women who got involved with him trusted him, definitely, that was the case. Ethel was a hypochondriac. So this was, as I said, it's a match made in heaven in many senses. And Ethel's mother was ill, and he used to treat. You know, Crippen would be very forthcoming in his treatment of people, and you know, friends were ill, and he'd recommend various potions and things like that. And I think that was a real benefit, especially in a time where you had to pay for medicine, and medicine was expensive, and this was before the NHS. So I think there were advantages to certainly being a doctor, and that was all part of the charm offensive too, I think.
Yes, you know, people who are very trusting of doctors. Well, I don't know about nowadays, but certainly, and not saying they shouldn't be. Please don't get that twisted. But definitely in the past, you know, a doctor would tell you to do anything, and you just absolutely do it.
Yeah.
Even if it was someone calling himself a doctor, but actually his qualifications weren't recognised here.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, I think you may have the final question. I think. Oh, there's somebody else as well. Okay, that's fine. You and then.
Just quickly, if it's not too early, because I know this book is just out, can you tell us what you're working on next?
Oh, God, I had a feeling this question was coming. I am working on something, but as of now, I cannot reveal what it is, because it hasn't been finalised. I mean, the formalities and the contracts and...
Not even a clue?
Not even, well...
Not even if it's fiction or non-fiction?
It's definitely non-fiction, and it's kind of roughly in this same time period as well. But the good news is that Story of a Murder has been optioned for television. So fingers crossed that comes off. And The Five has been optioned for television. Wow. And The Five has also been optioned to be a stage musical. Which is not how I envisioned it, but somebody else has the kind of imagination to see that. So all of those things are in the pipeline. Well, hopefully, you know, the thing is, when you say things are optioned, they may or may not ever see the light of day. So
my first book's been optioned as well.
Oh, good.
So I'm actually really pleased about that. What I didn't realise is that a lot of time can pass between an option and something
the development process is a long and winding road.
Yes, but it's wonderful to have that under my belt. So,
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I think there was
this lady here.
Yes.
Just going back to how it worked in the trial courtroom. In those days, did they have illustration of the participants in the press or anywhere?
Yes, they did. They had artists in the court doing drawings, which would appear in certain newspapers. I will tell you, it's interesting because they hadn't formalised rules around photography in the courtroom just yet. I think there were some judges who didn't want anything in the courtroom. And I think this particularly because it was a sensitive case and it was a high-profile case. However, people sneaked in cameras. And one woman sneaked in, I think, a camera in her hat. And bear in mind, the hats at the time were about as big as that gramophone horn, even bigger. And there was another man, now you'll love this, managed to sneak in a camera into the Old Bailey in a parcel. I mean, can you imagine bringing a parcel into the Old Bailey today?
And nobody looked at it.
No.
Now, mind you, I can almost top your story, and this is something that didn't happen at the Old Bailey, but it happened at Camberwell Green Magistrates Court, that somebody snuck in a weapon in a Kentucky chicken box, and it's amazing to me that it was the only place everyone used to go there because it was like the closest place. Everyone used to go there, but to be able to get that through and then try to use it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Gosh.
I'm not talking about a knife either. So yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
That's extraordinary.
It is extraordinary. That's why I remember it, even though it was years ago. Now that definitely wouldn't happen now, but because it was a really long time ago. But it was amazing that it even happened then.
Yeah.
You know, I think they felt, well, you know, someone's food, I can't look inside it. I don't know, but anyway, nobody got hurt, but it could so easily have gone very badly.
Very badly.
Yes, indeed.
Wow.
That's the kind of thing. If I put that in the book, people wouldn't believe it. All right, I think that is it. I'm just scouring if there's one last question. Nope. So, Hallie, it has been. You did intimidate me.
I find that impossible to believe. You are formidable.
But it was an absolute pleasure reading this. You have changed my mind on true crime, or historical crime, certainly. And the next one I read, they can thank you for the fact that I'm going to do it, because ordinarily I wouldn't do that at all. And it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you.
Thank you.
So everyone, give you a round.
Thank you. Thank you very much.